Hello sports fans, welcome to Super Sports Central. Today, we're going to be going over every NFL team's biggest offseason need. So we'll go through division by division, and we'll start things off in the AFC East with the Bills. The biggest need for the Bills is receiver, and it's been that way pretty much ever since they got rid of Stephon Diggs. Now they've obviously got Khalil Shakir, and he's a very solid player, but the Bills, they still need somebody else. Now Keon Coleman, they thought was going to be that guy, but he has just not been that good, and he had just 400 yards this past year. Plus, earlier in the offseason, the Bills came out and said they never wanted him in the first place, and that was a pick they made strictly because the coaching staff wanted him. A coaching staff that's no longer there, that is. But the Bills, they need somebody else for Josh Allen to throw the ball to, besides Khalil Shakir, and that is their biggest need. For the Patriots, their biggest need is the offensive line. We saw that pretty much single-handedly losing the Super Bowl because of their inability to protect Drake May, and they got to find a way to keep him on his feet. Now, as I was making this video, the Patriots did release Stephon Diggs, so I do think receiver becomes a pretty big need for them, although I would argue the offensive line is slightly more important. Moving on to the Dolphins, and they're a team where it's hard to come up with just one need. But if I had to come up with their biggest need, I would say it's the secondary. Now, they obviously need a quarterback because they're going to move on from Tua, but they have Quinn Ewers, who was a starter at the end of last year, and they could roll with him into next season. And I also don't think this is a team that is just a quarterback away, so that is why I think the secondary is slightly more important for this offseason. Because the secondary for the Dolphins was not good. They have a lot of free agents in the secondary, so I'd say that's their biggest need, but more specifically, corner. Moving on to the Jets. So the Jets, they're a team a lot like the Dolphins, where they need a lot. The Jets, they need like an entire defense and a quarterback. But the biggest need for the Jets is quarterback. Now that kind of goes against what I just said about the Dolphins, because the Jets, much like the Dolphins, are not just a quarterback away. But in the Dolphins' case, they at least have somebody who can play quarterback with Quinn Ewers. The Jets don't really have that because they're not going to give Justin Fields or Brady Cook another chance as the starter. So I do think the Jets' biggest need is to find a quarterback, especially because this is a team with some offensive talent. They've got Garrett Wilson, they've got a good running back in Breece Hall, who they just franchise tagged, and they've got a pretty good offensive line. So I definitely think the Jets, their biggest need is figuring out the quarterback position. Next team we have is the Steelers, and they're another tough one because their roster is obviously not great, but they also don't have one glaring hole in their roster. But you could say quarterback because there's no guarantee Aaron Rodgers is going to come back and he could retire. But I would say their biggest need for the Steelers is receiver. Now they've got DK Metcalf, but that's pretty much it because pretty much the entire rest of their receiving room is all free agent, including Calvin Austin, who's been pretty solid for them. But I would say the Steelers' biggest need is a wide receiver. Moving on to the Ravens, and their biggest need is the offensive line. Because the offensive line already wasn't amazing this past year, plus they've got some free agents up front, including center Tyler Linderbaum. So they've got to replace him if he leaves, or just upgrade the interior of the offensive line as a whole. Moving on to the Bengals, and they're another team with quite a few needs. Now, they need to fix the offensive line so they can keep Joe Burrow healthy, but they also need to improve the defense, which was awful this past season. But I would say the biggest need for the Bengals is the defense, but more specifically the defensive line. Because the defense and the defensive line already wasn't great. Now they're losing Trey Hendrickson to free agency, so that might make their defense even worse. But I would say the Bengals' biggest need is improving the defense. They're not allowing 50 points a game. Moving on to the Browns, and they're another team with quite a few needs. And their biggest need is pretty much an entire new offense. But if I have to say their biggest need, I would say it's the quarterback position, just like it's been for the last 25 plus years. Now they've got 3 quarterbacks on the roster with Shedeur Sanders, Dylan Gabriel, and Deshaun Watson, but I don't really think any of those guys are the long-term answer, so the Browns need to find a solution at quarterback. Next team up is the Jaguars, and they're a team that I think is in a pretty good spot because they don't really have many holes on their roster. But there's definitely some areas the Jaguars can definitely upgrade. And I think the biggest position of need would be the front 7. Because their defensive line was great this past year, but they've got some free agents along the defensive line. Plus linebacker Devin Wood is a free agent, and the Jaguars aren't really in a position where they can afford to pay him. So I think replacing Devin Wood and other players in the front 7 would be the biggest offseason priority for the Jaguars. Up next, we got the Texans, and their biggest need is CJ Stroud going back to his rookie form. Now, that's not something they can obviously do, but something they can do is improve the offensive line, which definitely is not going to hurt CJ Stroud. But the offensive line has not been very good. Their defense is already great. The offense has some playmakers, it's just been held back by a bad offensive line, so that is definitely something the Texans will improve. Moving on to the Colts. So the Colts, I'm going to say their biggest need is their defense. Because the offense was pretty good last year before Daniel Jones got hurt, and I think they're in a pretty good spot once again. But the defense for the Colts wasn't great this past year, especially late in the season. Now, having a healthy Sauce Gardner will definitely help the pass defense, but the front 7, and specifically the pass rush, can definitely be a lot better. Because this past year, the Colts, they had just one player with more than 4 sacks. so getting another pass rusher should definitely be the top priority for the Colts. Moving on to the Titans. So the Titans, they're another team with quite a few needs, but I think their biggest need is getting Cam Ward another weapon. Because he showed a lot of potential as a rookie, and he showed some flashes of being a great quarterback, but he still did not have much talent around him. So surrounding Cam Ward with talent should definitely be their top priority, especially after the leading pass catcher from this past season had just 560 receiving yards. Moving on to the Broncos. So the Broncos, they're another team where it's tougher to come up with need because they're in a pretty good spot, and there's not very many holes on this roster. But they do have a couple free agent linebackers they can look to re-sign, but I think their biggest need is getting Bo Nix another playmaker. Because they've got J.K. Dobbins, but he's a free agent and he struggles to stay on the field, and Evan Ingram just hasn't been that good, and the receiver room outside of Courtland Sutton is nothing too special. So I think getting Bo Nix another playmaker is the Broncos' biggest need. Up next, we've got the Chiefs. So the Chiefs, they're a team where you can say a few different things for their biggest need. They need to improve the offensive line, they need a running back, and they can definitely improve the defense, especially after trading away Trent McDuffie. But obviously the biggest need for the Chiefs is running back. Now obviously it's not the most important position, but the Chiefs, they definitely need to do something to improve their run game, which over the past few years has not been that great. And with Kareem Hunt and Isaiah Pacheco both free agents, Chiefs definitely need to do something at the running back position. Moving on to the Chargers, and their biggest need is easily the interior of the offensive line. Because they've got two really good tackles with Rashawn Slater and Joe Alt, they just need to stay healthy, but the interior of that offensive line is awful, and that is a big reason the Chargers' offensive line was so bad this past year. But the Chargers, they need to protect Justin Herbert and improve that offensive line. Moving on to the Raiders. So they're a team with a ton of needs. Their biggest one is probably quarterback, but because they're going to take Fernando Mendoza number 1 and solve that need, I'm going to say their biggest need is the offensive line. Because their offensive line was awful this past year, and even if Fernando Mendoza is a great quarterback, he's not going to do much playing behind a terrible offensive line. So the Raiders got to find a way to improve that O-line. Moving on to the NFC teams, starting off with the Eagles. So the Eagles, they're another interesting team because overall, looking at their roster, I still think they have one of the better rosters in the NFL. But there's still definitely areas that can improve. The offensive line, they could use another edge rusher, and I definitely think they could take another receiver, especially if they end up trading A.J. Brown. But I would say the biggest need for the Eagles is the offensive line. But overall, I still think this is a pretty solid team. Moving on to the Cowboys, and their biggest need is easily the defense. The offense was great this past year, but the defense was quite awful. But the Cowboys, they need help at all three levels. You can say they need an edge rusher, linebacker, corner, really whatever you want, but their biggest priority is fixing that defense. Moving on to the Giants, and their biggest need I would say is linebacker. Because the linebacker room already wasn't that great. Now they've released Bobby Okereke to clear cap space, so now they really need a linebacker. And the Giants, I also think they're going to end up with a pretty good linebacker, because John Harbaugh has always had elite linebackers including his defense. Moving on to the Commanders, and I would say their biggest need is quite a few things. A defense, a running back, a receiver, you could really say a bunch of different things, but I think the biggest need for the Commanders is fixing that defense and getting an edge rusher. Because this past year, they did not get much pressure on opposing quarterbacks. And their top pass rusher this year was a 36-year-old Von Miller. And even if they bring him back, he's still not getting any younger, and it's always helpful to have more than one guy who can rush the quarterback. Moving on to the Bears. So the biggest need for the Bears, I would say, is the interior of the defensive line. Because this is a defense that wasn't great this past year, and that started with their inability to stop the run. So giving Montez Sweat some help along the defensive line and getting somebody on the interior that can stop the run would definitely be a good move for the Bears. Moving on to the Packers, and their biggest need is either the offensive line or the defensive line, or maybe corner. But I think their biggest need is the defensive front and the defensive line. Because Micah Parsons was great, but he can definitely use some help along that defensive line. Plus, they're losing linebacker Quay Walker to free agency. Moving on to the Lions, and I would say their biggest need is the offensive line. Now that sounds weird to say because over the past few years they've had one of the better offensive lines in the NFL, but they were not as good this past year, and they're also losing a couple players. As Dan Skipper's retiring, Graham Glasgow is a free agent, and left tackle Taylor Decker is returning, although he's definitely not their long-term answer at left tackle. So improving the offensive line, definitely the top priority for the Lions. Moving on to the Vikings, and they're an interesting one because they're a pretty good team. They just need decent quarterback play from J.J. McCarthy. But if I have to come up with the position of need for the Vikings, I would say defensive tackle. Because they're releasing Jonathan Allen and Javon Hargrave, and now there's pretty much nobody up front on that defense. Moving on to the Falcons, and they're another interesting one. Because a lot like the Vikings, they've got a pretty solid roster. Now, I don't think the roster is quite as good as the Vikings, but I do think it's pretty good. But the Falcons, they're a lot like the Vikings because they just need their quarterback from the 2024 draft class to stay healthy and play good football when healthy. But if I have to come up with a position for the Falcons, I'd say corner. AJ Terrell is great, but outside of him, the position's not that great. Plus, you can never have enough corners. Up next, we've got the Panthers. And I think their biggest need is the offensive line. Left tackle Akeem Ekwonu got hurt in the playoffs, and he's going to be out for a while. Plus, they've got a lot of free agents along the offensive line. So, whether it's re-signing some of those free agents or drafting replacements or whatever they're going to do, they need to improve the offensive line. Up next, we've got the Buccaneers, and their biggest need is a pass rusher, because this pass rush was not good this past year, and that's just one player with more than 5 sacks. And not being able to pressure the quarterback was a pretty big reason the Buccaneers' pass defense and defense as a whole was not that great. Moving on to the Saints, and I think their biggest need is getting Tyler Shough some weapons. Because they've got Chris Olave and he's good when healthy, but outside of him, it's really not that great, besides an aging Alvin Kamara. So surrounding your young quarterback with talent, never a bad idea, and I think that's what the Saints should focus on this offseason. Moving on to the Seahawks, and I think their biggest need is bringing back or replacing a lot of their free agents. Because the Seahawks, they have a ton of players who are set to become free agents who are actually pretty important to their Super Bowl run. Because Kenneth Walker, Rashid Shaheed, Boye Mafe, Josh Jobe, Tariq Woolen, and Kobe Bryant are all set to become free agents. Now, obviously, they're not going to be able to bring back all those guys, but whether it's bring back some of them or drafting replacements, they got to find a way to replace those because a lot of those guys play pretty important roles. Up next, we've got the Rams. And the Rams, they're an interesting one because they traded for Trent McDuffie as I was making this video. But I still think they can use another corner because McDuffie's obviously only one guy, and they could still use some help in the rest of the secondary. Moving on to the 49ers, and their biggest need is finding a way to stay on the field. But that's not something they can really do by just signing somebody or drafting somebody. So if I have to come up with a position of need for the 49ers, I would say receiver. Because they're going to move on from Brandon Ayuk after he didn't play at all this year. Juwan Jennings is a free agent, and after that receiver room is pretty thin, besides Ricky Pearsall, who, like the rest of the 49ers, just can't stay on the field. So the 49ers can definitely use another receiver. And the final team is the Arizona Cardinals, and I think their biggest need is quarterback. They cut Kyler Murray, and now they're left with Jacoby Brissett, and he's definitely not their long-term answer. So the Cardinals, they got to find a franchise quarterback. But that is what I think the biggest offseason need is for every NFL team. Thank you guys for watching. Be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn notifications. I do my best to post as often as possible, and I will see you in the next video.